weekly national briefing. I'm Sunita Sarabji, health editor at ACOM, and your moderator for today's discussion. I produce these briefings every week with my colleague, Pilar Marrero. Mass shootings and gun violence have become a grim and recurring feature of life in the US. Even as the number of mass shootings have declined to their lowest levels in 2 decades, the US still has the largest number of gun-related deaths than any of its peer nations. Yet, despite the national outrage that follows every mass shooting, policy responses remain uneven and polarized, constrained by constitutional debates and American gun culture. Speakers this week will discuss the factors behind mass shootings, necessary policy interventions at the federal level, and successful community initiatives at the local level, including Baltimore and New York. We invite speakers to post their questions in the chat, and we will immediately address as many as possible after each speaker presents. We ask speakers to speak slowly for our simultaneous interpreters in Korean, Mandarin, and Spanish. Jessica, could you please start the live stream now? So please welcome our speakers. Dr. Raji Girgis, Director of the Center of Prevention and Evaluation at Columbia University. Dr. Daniel Webster, Bloomberg Professor of American Health at Johns Hopkins University. And Sarah Lerner, co-founder of Teachers Unified to End Gun Violence. Please note that Shika Hamilton from Brady United will not be joining us today due to a family emergency. So we begin with Sarah Lerner, a high school teacher who will offer a first-hand account of the 2018 mass shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, along with recommendations for early interventions and support for survivors. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Sunita, and thank you to everyone on the call. It's a pleasure to be here. I will jump right into my story. I have been a teacher since 2002. I taught elsewhere before going to Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, and I have been there since 2014. I was on campus on February 14th, 2018, when a gunman opened fire, killing 17, injuring 17, and traumatizing an entire community. I was in my class with my seniors. We had a fire drill, a planned fire drill that day. And at 2:20, which was about 20 minutes before school was over, the fire alarm went off. I was giving a quiz to my senior English class, and we all kind of shrugged our shoulders and looked at each other quizzically. And I grabbed my phone and my keys and went outside. I heard what sounded like firecrackers, which was the sound of the gunshots kind of, bouncing off the buildings. And I didn't know where to go. I saw everyone running. And so my gut instinct was to go home, which on campus is my classroom. So I went back upstairs to my classroom. I had about 10 of my students and 5 from the class next door. And I got everybody in, and we were on lockdown for, I think I was in my room for at least 3 hours before the SWAT team let us out. And it was the most horrific experience I have had in my entire life. My children were almost 9 and 12 at the time. My son, who was 12, was in the middle school next door. His school was on lockdown, and having to text your tween that there's an active shooter on campus, I'm okay, I'm not shot, is nothing that you ever think you're going to text your children. And I lost 2 students that day. Meadow Pollock, I had when she was a freshman. She was a senior the day of the event. And Jamie Guttenberg, I had that year as a freshman. She was in my intro to journalism class. I should note that I'm the yearbook and newspaper advisor, so I am a fellow journalist. Um, at the time, I was advising only the yearbook, um, and we worked to cover everything that we could, not about the incident per se, but about the aftermath and who the victims were. And we did profiles for each of them, and we covered all of the time that we were out of school and the students who went to Tallahassee, which is the state capital in Florida, to advocate for stronger gun laws, and all of the work that was happening um, during the time that we were back at the end of that school year. I was approached by a senior editor at Random House Publishing and was asked to edit and help compile work for this anthology that became Parkland Speaks, which was released in 2019, January of 2019. And the book contains artwork, photography, poetry, prose, firsthand accounts, congressional testimony from 42 survivors, including two pieces that I wrote. And it was really important for me to do that because it was our story to tell. And I, as a journalist and a journalism teacher, I didn't want there to be any spin on what we experienced. And there's something very powerful about reading these pieces by students who were friends with students who passed away or were in the classrooms where this all took place. So, fast forward a few years, and I had been connected with Abby Clements, who is a survivor from Sandy Hook, and Sari Beth Rosenberg, who is a teacher in New York City. And the three of us were actively in a group chat together, as people do. And the shooting at Oxford High School happened. And we were so incensed that this continued to happen all of these years between Sandy Hook to my school, and all of the ones in between up to Oxford. And the three of us decided that we had had enough, and there has not been a teacher voice in the gun violence prevention space. So one weekend afternoon, we just decided to start this organization. And within a half hour, we had our name picked out, social media handles. We had a very basic website. Um, and that was how Teachers Unified to End Gun Violence started back in December of 2021. We just celebrated our fourth anniversary. And we have, oh my God, tens of thousands of member advocates across the country. We are working to be a resource for communities that have experienced gun violence. And I know, or I'm sure that the two doctors on the call will make note of this, but it should be noted that school shootings are such a small piece of gun violence, but they get the most media coverage. And, our goal in Teachers Unify is to amplify these educator voices, because it isn't just the school shootings, it's the teachers who deal with students who have community gun violence, it's domestic violence, it's anti-Semitic, anti-Asian, whatever gun violence. And some of these teachers may experience gun violence in their own communities on top of what their students go through. So we want to be a resource and a voice for all of these teachers, because we are the ones in the classrooms every single day, listening to the stories, wiping the tears, giving the hugs, and helping navigate this space. I know part of the focus of today's call kind of came about after the shooting at Brown University. And one of my students, I actually know three students who are current students at Brown, but one of them is a freshman and she was on my yearbook staff all 4 years. And she texted me at 4:32 that there was an active shooter on campus and she was on lockdown in the library. The news hadn't even broke, like there were no stories yet. So the fact that Ella texted me, I was trying to find whatever information I could, but there was none at that point. So she and I were texting back and forth the whole time. And it was hours and hours and hours until she was released. And she has come home for winter break and she's not too far from where I am. Excuse me. Um, but, and I was talking to some Teachers Unify people yesterday that getting these texts from Ella and being in this conversation with her, it really put me back in like where I was almost 8 years ago because my journalism students would reach out to me and we would text and support each other. And it just felt very much like that. And, I felt my anxiety and my trauma being kind of activated, but I know I need to be a support for Ella. So this is kind of the line that we walk as teachers. You want to take care of yourself and your own mental health, but you also know that you are a sense of support and security for your students. Um, I hope I didn't talk too long. I know we have a little more wiggle room, but I'm happy to keep going or if there if there are
Please do
questions.
keep going. Yes, we would welcome
Sure,
you. Yeah.
of course. Um, so it took about 6 months for me to like really process what happened and kind of cleared some of the cobwebs out of my brain just because of trauma and shock. Um, and I have always been a huge advocate of mental health and mental health resources. And I went to therapy and I did some EMDR uh, therapy, which was incredibly helpful. And it really, it I hate using the word helpful again, but it really helped to kind of navigate this new space that I found myself in. And through my own mental health journey and the work that I have done and we as an organization have done, we have been able to support so many people and so many communities that have come after us. And I have said from the beginning, it should never have happened to us, but it should have stopped with us. I was almost 19 when Columbine happened. My son was in first grade when Sandy Hook happened. I lived 3 hours from the Pulse nightclub. There are all of these touches of gun violence, and I mean, you never think it's going to happen to you, and then it does, and you find yourself in this life and in this space that you never pictured yourself in. As a journalist and a journalism teacher, I like to be kind of in the know and I love talking clearly and all of that, but I did not expect to, be kind of like thrust into the spotlight as I was immediately after and in the years that have followed. But I'm happy to be a voice. I'm happy to be a resource, and I hope that I can answer your questions today.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I know that must have been really difficult to share with us, and I truly appreciate you being able to do that. My first question, we have a number of questions for you, but I think I'll take the liberty of asking the first question. After the shooting, what was it like for your students and for your fellow teachers to come back to the classroom?
Um, school was closed for about 2 weeks. The principal at the time insisted that we did not return to school until all 17 funerals had been held, and he was very adamant about that. So we came back about 2 weeks later. Uh, Speaking only for myself, there was no teaching happening, and I know 90% of the teachers at school felt the same way. How could I expect my students to finish reading 1984? How could I expect them to read Macbeth when everyone dies in the play? Like, it's impractical and it's insensitive and it just wasn't realistic. So there was a lot of social emotional learning, and we had therapy dogs, and I mean just the generosity from across the country and from internationally with uh donations and food and games and coloring books and all of those things. It really was helpful for the students and for us. I mean, so many resources just kind of descended on our community because I think when something like this happens, people don't know what to do. So they just do everything. Like they just throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. And, you know, it was it was very kind, and it meant a lot to us that so many people cared about this seemingly small community in South Florida that if you had asked someone where Parkland was before 2018, I doubt any of you would know where it is, and now everyone knows where it is.
Absolutely. Our first question comes from Nestor Fantini. Nestor, welcome, and please ask your question.
So sorry for what you had to go through, Mrs. Lerner.
Thank
Um, my question, so the in 2024, Tennessee passed a law that allows teachers to carry weapons. Um, do you think that this improves school safety, uh, or are there potential risk or unintended consequences of actually approving this kind of policy?
After the shooting at school, President Trump in his first term had suggested the idea of arming teachers, and I was on CNN opposite a sheriff from Ohio, and I'm sure you can find the clip on YouTube, but it's like angry teacher yells at sheriff. Like to me personally, it is the most outrageous suggestion, and it doesn't make any sense. You're adding more guns, more weapons to a campus. If I'm armed and, you know, what if a student gets a hold of my gun? What if I think someone is the intruder and I shoot the wrong person? Who's paying for this weapon? Who's paying for me to get trained? Where is all of this money coming from? You're adding more weapons to schools where there are significant numbers of students of color, and that is going to be you know, uncomfortable and extra traumatizing for them. It's impractical and it's illogical to me that arming teachers is the way that we can protect our students. Like I went to college to study English, not to become a police officer or a security guard. And I know there are teachers who would be okay being armed. I am not one of them.
Thank you. Renee Barbie is next. Renee, please ask your question.
Thank you. I remember that day, and I am also truly sorry for your loss. What do you believe the government should do to prevent gun violence at all schools throughout our country? Is there any good answer to prevent these tragedies from happening?
Thank you,
Yeah,
Renee.
yeah. I mean, I think we all know that guns are the leading cause of death in children in America. And again, I don't want to step on the doctor's toes, but we know this. And every day, an average of 57 shootings occur near a school in the United States. So, what needs to happen is we need to have common sense gun laws and regulations. We need to work on secure storage. We need to, worry less about banning books and more about banning weapons of war. I we're not trying to come for your guns, but we want you, if you're going to have weapons, they need to be properly stored and secured. You need to be licensed. Ghost guns are a huge issue. And, people who may find these loopholes and not do background checks, people who should not have a weapon or have access to a weapon. Like there are so many things that can be done. In Florida, after the shooting, a law was passed to change the age from 18 to 21 to be able to buy a firearm, and it has since been rolled back to 18. And it's things like this that are so frustrating, you know, given that there have been at least two mass shootings in Florida alone between my school and Pulse, not to mention all of the other shootings. But like 4.5 million kids live in homes with unsecured loaded firearms. And kind of going off on a tangent, Renee, for a moment. My friend, when I was in high school, it was 1995, and he was at another friend's house. The dad was a police officer. The friend's dad was a police officer, and they were looking at the gun. The gun went off, and my friend Andrew was shot and killed instantly. And those things happen too. It's accidental shootings, it's friendly fire, it's drive-bys, it's all of these things. And if people who shouldn't have guns don't have guns, we can eliminate this. If there are laws enacted, and, I don't know how political I can get on the show, Sunita, but if we
You
can,
can.
okay, if the politicians who have the NRA in their back pocket would care more about their constituents than an A+ rating and money, we could save millions of lives.
Yes. Absolutely. Thank you. There are a number of questions for you. We'll go back to them after Dr. Gerges and Dr. Webster speak, but thank you so much for
Of
sharing your
course.
story with us and your comments. We move to Dr. Ragi Gerges, who will discuss the factors behind mass shootings and dispel media myths, misconceptions, I should say, about who these shooters are. Dr. Gerges, welcome.
Hi, Sunita. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for joining. So, I'm a psychiatrist at Columbia University. I'm a professor of clinical psychiatry. I study schizophrenia, and I began to study violence and schizophrenia about 10 years ago. About 6 years ago, some colleagues and I really wanted to answer as definitively as possible for ourselves whether there is a relationship between mental illness and mass shootings, because of course everything we hear about and see about mass shootings in the media and otherwise. So we really wanted to take a like scientific evidence-based approach to this question. So what we did, we assembled the largest database of mass murder in existence. We examined every possible mass murder defined as three or more fatalities in an event that has occurred since 1900. So we wanted to examine changes over time. We included mass murder all around the globe from every country. Of course, we were limited to reports in the English language, but we wanted to examine differences between countries over time, and most critically, as I'll mention later, a decision we made was to include all types of mass murder. So not just mass murder perpetrated with firearms, which are mass shootings, but also mass murder perpetrated with other methods. Because as you all may understand, whenever we do science, since we don't have the extent of all knowledge in the world, which if we had would be adequate to not include different groups or comparisons. But since we don't have all knowledge in the world or all data, we need to compare groups to understand specific relationships between variables that we're examining. So we included all types of mass murder. And in particular, we focused on what we refer to as personal cause mass murder, all the type of mass murder with which we're familiar and which we hear about and with which about which we're talking, like school shootings, are personal cause mass murder. This excludes gang violence. This includes war. This includes political or state-sponsored terrorism. So we're focusing on this personal cause mass murder with which we're familiar. Either way, we included about 2,300 cases of mass murder all around the globe since 1900. Again, our focus was on mental illness, but we also examined other variables, of course. So what we found was very simple. Bottom line, the vast majority, so just looking at the prevalence rates, the vast majority of mass shootings in particular are not related to mental illness at all. There are a few ways that we examine this. So one, we did an extensive motivational analysis of every single mass murder. And for a mass murder to be caused by a mental illness, what it turns out is that it can only be really caused by someone who has a psychotic illness and who has a delusion or hallucination that impels them or compels them to perpetrate a mass shooting. So, for example, they would be delusional and think that their life is in danger, or they would be hallucinating, for example, hear a voice telling them, maybe it's God or someone telling them, or Satan or whatever, to take the lives of people. So that's very rare, but it does happen. That accounts for exactly 5% of mass shootings in America. 95% of mass shootings are not related to mental illness. Another way we examined this was by just examining prevalence rates of mental illness among people who perpetrate mass shootings. So in the general population, the overall lifetime, for example, nowadays, prevalence of any sort of mental illness is about 40 to 45%. The prevalence of mental illness among mass shooters is about 45 to 50%. So you get that 5% difference. A lot of people, again, they misunderstand, that correlation is not causation thing, that they don't fully understand that, and that's really the truth. So about half of people who perpetrate a mass shooting are going to have a mental illness. But again, about 40 to 45% of the general population has a mental illness. So we have to better understand these things. That's really important. And then third, we examined mass shooters and people who perpetrate mass murder with other methods. And what we found is that the prevalence of mental illness, and especially we're talking about psychotic disorders like schizophrenia, but the prevalence of mental illness among people who perpetrate mass murder with other methods is much higher than among mass shooters. What that means is that there's a lack of a specific relationship between mental illness and using a firearm to perpetrate a mass murder. So we learned a number of other things, and again, focusing on mental illness related topics, but a few other things. So number one, among these other things, is the role of suicide. So now, and this has been increasing over time, but now over 50% of mass shooters take their life at the time of the event. That's really important for a number of reasons. One, we realized that we also wanted to answer why people choose firearms to perpetrate a mass murder rather than other methods. So, for example, why don't they choose automobiles? Why don't they use poison? Why don't they use other methods? It turns out the number one reason people choose firearms by far is because firearms are the method that they use to take their life. The other critical kind of thing to understand about the importance of suicide to mass shootings is that the way we understand things is that there are kind of three barriers to perpetrating a mass shooting or any sort of major event, but a mass shooting in particular in this case. Number one is one's own conscience or moral system or belief in God and religious system or whatever, your moral values, basically. Number two are those kind of values that you internalize from family, those close to you, friends, those society. And number three is the fear of being caught and incarcerated. So once you decide to take your life, just so you know, we also showed in our papers, and we've published all this. These are all like published papers, peer-reviewed published papers. People plan their attacks, so they know for weeks, months, sometimes years ahead of time, and they also plan to take their life. So how we understand it is that once someone decides to take their life, that third barrier to perpetrating a mass shooting has been removed, and so it becomes easier to perpetrate a mass shooting. We also examined maybe the hottest button kind of issue with regards to mass shootings and especially mental illness or mental health, and that is the role of antidepressants or psychiatric medications in general, but especially antidepressants. And nothing is less of a contributor to mass shootings than antidepressant medications and psychiatric medications in general. I mean, we published this, the data are out there. I can go into this in many ways, but the bottom line is antidepressants definitely do not cause mass shootings or suicide for that matter, and they certainly prevent suicide. We don't know whether they prevent violence or mass shootings in general. That work just hasn't been done. They probably do, but we don't know as much about that. So then a question is, so what does cause mass shootings from the psychological, motivational, mental health perspective? So number one, I would say just from, a lot of people maybe don't fully understand what mental illness is. So they see any abnormal behavior or idea or emotion as being mental illness. And if that were the case, of course, 100% of people would have mental illness. For example, serial killers rarely have mental illness. They almost never perpetrate what they do because of mental illness. Almost all, and in fact, 87% of serial killers are psychopaths. They kill because they enjoy killing. That's what they do. That's who they are. However, the prevalence of psychopathy, or rather, psychopathy as a motivation for mass shootings, happens in 2% of cases. So there's really something specific about mass shootings. And we've published our whole motivational system and everything. But if we focus on public mass shootings, there is a 3-point psychological profile. Number one, we find that these mass shooters have a great affinity for or a fascination with firearms. So gun availability is definitely a big issue, and we're going to address that as my last point. But these people actually also have a great fascination with or affinity for firearms. Number two, it is nihilism, a severe emptiness, a feeling that basically they have no life in its most severe form that leads to suicide. And number three is narcissism. So not the way that kind of we generally understand narcissism, people being very self-absorbed, they think they're very great, arrogant. Narcissism from the psychodynamic perspective involves a low self-esteem and then taking that out on other people. That's kind of the psychological profile. So finally, in like our most recent paper, it was like I think our 9th or 10th from our database, we wanted to specifically examine the roles of firearm policy and firearms in general in mass shootings. So what we found is what people have found when examining gun violence of any sort. And there's tons of data and there's tons of research on this. But the fact of the matter is that mass shootings are very, very, very strongly linked to firearm policy. You could look at state firearm laws. Weaker state firearm laws is very strongly associated with both the number of mass shootings per capita and the number of victims per capita. You could examine the federal assault weapons ban. The data are a little weaker, but about the same. And in fact, the vast majority of weapons that are used in mass shootings are legally acquired. We also have to understand that even though illegal, quote unquote, illegally acquired firearms are used in the minority of mass shootings, essentially all firearms in America are legally acquired. They're manufactured by firearm manufacturers, and they become illegal. They're not originally illegal. And that's really critical as we think about how to deal with this. So ultimately, we need to strengthen our firearm policies. And really, we need to enforce our firearm laws. Some firearm laws, especially in certain states, are theoretically should be okay, but I mean, they're just simply not enforced. I mean, for the most part, they're just not enforced. So, I mean, that's basically a summary of what we've done and what we found. I'll leave it there. I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Gerges. And Dr. Gerges has sent over a number of papers that we will send to you all with follow-up collateral. I'm going to ask the first question from my ACOM colleague, Oni Advincula. Oni asks, because mental health illness has been used to scapegoat gun violence, how does this publicly blaming mental illness for gun violence contribute to stigma and discrimination against people with mental health conditions? Does this make them less likely to seek out the treatment that they might need?
Uh, how does it do it? It does it. Just so I can just affirm what you're saying. It definitely does. There's no doubt about it. In a great way, it does prevent people seeking care. Stigma, as you all know, is a major problem in the mental health community. I mean, it's gotten better over time, over the past several decades to some degree, but obviously it's still a major problem. And ultimately, it's just a straw man. It's just a straw man argument. It doesn't lead anywhere. So it's not helpful in any way.
Interesting. Lori Lee from the Dallas Gazette has the first question. Lori?
Yes, thank you. I was wondering, how big of a role does racism play in this problem?
Yeah. So if we're talking about personal cause mass murder, racism is the primary motivating factor in about 2 to 3% of these sorts of mass murders.
Okay. Pamela Cruz from Immigrant Magazine asks a question from a mental health perspective. What warning signs are most often missed before mass shootings, and how can communities intervene earlier without stigmatizing mental illness? Yeah, I think the first part of this question is really important. What warning signs are we missing as communities?
Right. So that's a very good question. So only about 5% of mass shootings are actually caused by mental illness. But if we take a step back and just think about general risk factors and maybe you know emotional predictors and those sorts of things, the bottom line is the number one risk. Most risk factors would be very nonspecific. However, uh, many, if not most, of these mass shooters do produce or produce basically there's leakage. Leakage meaning they tell people what they're going to do ahead of time.
Interesting. Nora Estrada has the next question. Nora? I'll ask her question for her. Are societal values being lost, and do violent video games and movies incite violence? I think that's a question that a lot of us have about the role of violent video games.
So yes, yes, and yes. So in addition to, the availability of guns and weak firearm policies, what we know is that the prevalence of mass shootings and all types of mass murder, but mass shootings in general, was per capita was stable between 1900 and 1970, 1980. Since then, the rate has increased fourfold per capita. So the question is, why did that happen? What happened in the 70s, early 80s, etc., to cause this? This is where the romanticization of essentially violence and especially gun violence has come into play. Again, movies and television were available before the 70s, but it was only in the 70s into the 80s when home movie rentals became a thing, and media really took over the landscape. And this has only worsened with social media and now AI and everything. So this outsized influence of the entertainment media, so we're talking movies, television, video games, and the music industry, has definitely contributed to this epidemic.
Thank you. Henrietta Burrows has the next question. Henrietta?
Thanks so much, Sunita. If a mass shooter is going to take their own life, is it that they want to take others with them? So, what is it that comes first? The idea of the mass shooting, and then the idea of suicide, or the idea of suicide, and then the idea of shooting others?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. So, the way we're understanding it now is that probably the idea is about murder first, and then the suicide kind of is the last barrier to actually perpetrating it. It turns out that I can go through the details later, but if there were no if there were no risk of being caught, 1 in 100 people would perpetrate murder. Right now, the prevalence of murder is about 1 in 10,000 in America. If there were no barrier, like if there were no concerns about incarceration or being caught, 1 in 100 people in America would perpetrate a murder.
Wow, interesting. Last question for you comes from Araceli Martinez of La Opinión. Araceli, please ask your question.
Thank you, Sunita. Doctor, California is the state with the most advanced laws to control gun violence. Do you think these types of laws help prevent these massacres? I also would like to ask you, I have seen a lot of fascination and adoration of gun in this country. Why do you think I haven't seen this in other countries? Even I'm from Mexico, but this is a thing that I feel very, I feel a lot of curiosity about why this country has such adoration for guns. Thank you, Doctor.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So yes to your first question about California firearm policies and laws. And number two, I mean, that's maybe a longer discussion. It's a misunderstanding of it's a misunderstanding of the founding of the country and what kind of the Second Amendment and what guns were about. Again, I won't go into it, but how America understood guns through or felt about guns through the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, and early 20th century was very different than how we kind of approach or think about guns now.
Dr. Gerkes, thank you so much. There are a number of questions for you in the chat, and if you could answer them there, that would be terrific. Thank you. Our final speaker today is Dr. Daniel Webster, who will discuss the downward trend in gun violence, and he will also discuss successful community-based interventions. Dr. Webster, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Of course.
If you only read, watch, or listen to headlines, you'd probably think gun violence in the United States is not only incredibly high, but continues to increase. The data tell a different story. Now, for decades, the United States has had a homicide rate that, dwarfs other high-income countries. If we compare the average high-income country, their rates, the U.S. homicide rate is about 8 times higher. And if you look at homicides committed with firearms, our rate's about 25 times higher. So we're an outlier. We should feel badly about it, and we should do everything we can to address it. But I want to focus more on some positive news and sort of what maybe we can draw from that to think about, how we continue to get to a better place and much lower rates of gun violence. So first of all, a lot of the data I'm going to mention are basically overall homicide numbers or rates. And you should know that almost 80% of these homicides in our country are committed with a firearm. And when we are able to get trends for non-fatal shootings, the patterns are often quite similar to these fatal outcomes. So after gun violence surged in 2020 and then plateaued at a slightly higher rate in 2021 and 2022, homicides in the United States have been on a steep downward trajectory. So what I often look at and a lot of crime analysts look at is what we call a 12-month rolling average. So when you look at these 12-month rolling averages, you're not going to be influenced by sort of the seasonality. There is some seasonality in gun violence, but you can compare different data points across a time span to get a sense of the general trajectory. So looking at those 12-month rolling averages and data assembled by the Real-Time Crime Index led by Jeff Asher, homicides within the United States have dropped by about 40% from our peak in 2021 and 22. If the data right now are available through October of this year, the data I've seen in some other cities, pardon me, in certain cities, trending into this year, show that this downward trajectory continues and may even be going down slightly more. There's some variation in this decline, of course, across cities and across states, but nearly all places in the United States have enjoyed much lower rates of homicides in recent years. Again, if we think about or look at that 12-month rolling average, Detroit's homicides have declined 76% since the peak in 2021 and 2022. Baltimore, Philadelphia, New Orleans, these are all cities, as is Detroit, that historically have had very high rates of homicide. So in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New Orleans, homicides are down 60% over this time period. The rate, as I mentioned, of decline is getting steeper. And some are predicting that when all the data are totaled for this year, we could have the lowest murder rate since the FBI started publishing data in 1960. And I'll also just note some of the most recent declines are sharpest among youth in their 20s. So what's going on here? There's been a lot of theorizing and speculation about what's causing these historic reductions in gun violence. However, there's been little in the way of very formal empirical research to test the hypothesis. We'll know more in months or maybe even years down the road, but I'll tell you that these reductions started well before various surges in immigration law enforcement and the deployment of the National Guard in some cities. I want to just be as clear as can be that there's a lot of research that shows immigrants have notably lower rates of violent offending than US-born citizens, and very few of the individuals who have been arrested and detained recently by these surges, federal surges, have histories that include serious violence. So getting to how we understand this big decline, I want to just, of course, mention we have to think about what drove violence up so dramatically. The increase from 2019 to 2020 was the largest one-year increase in firearm homicides in our nation's history. Of course, it coincided with the onset of the COVID-19 shutdowns, and in many cities also coincided with large protests against police violence. Some of the largest increases in gun violence occurred in cities with the largest and most destructive of these protests on both sides, meaning violence from both protesters and police, and where community trust in law enforcement, as well as government generally, was weak. We also saw at this time historic rises in personal firearm purchases, and all systems were strained: police, courts, prisons, social services, education, and of course, healthcare during this time period. So they were all weakened by the pandemic and less able to respond to the chaos and stresses that unfolded during that time that enabled the surge in violence. So while there are important programs and initiatives that have helped drive down violence in each city, there's also a national phenomenon then that it's driving these rates down. We're seeing of course, we saw the unwinding of the pandemic and the strengthening of all those systems that I just mentioned and their ability to address crime and violence. It's important to understand that the federal government under President Joe Biden injected funding into the cities to address a multitude of needs during the COVID crisis. And many of these resources were used to curb violence, including massive investments in community violence intervention programs. Specifically in 2022, the Bipartisan Safer Community Act was signed into law. It had many important provisions that expanded background check requirements, but while there were improvements from a gun control standpoint, that act was more a funding mechanism that was generating resources for communities to address violence through community violence intervention programs, law enforcement, strengthening mental health, and also even implementing the kind of extreme risk protection order laws that I think were alluded to in the case of mass shootings. Cities created and expanded special offices for violence prevention and that were overseeing and orchestrating these community violence intervention initiatives. They were also supporting technical assistance to groups around the country, cities around the country. And one of the approaches, sometimes now it's called group violence reduction strategy, but it's an interesting combination that focuses law enforcement, but also social services and community supports for individuals at highest risk for involvement in gun violence. So we've seen an expansion of those programs as well across many cities. One additional thing I want to note, because it's something I'm studying right now, is 1 month after this legislation was passed in 2022, the Biden administration also adopted a new rule to regulate ghost gun kits. Sometimes it's referred to as privately made firearms. And our cities were flooded with these ghost guns. They're called ghost guns because they previously went around the whole regulatory system. Not only could they not be traced, but the background checks and record keeping and everything connected to how we regulate guns, it bypassed them. I studied this carefully in Baltimore, and I will tell you that these guns were going directly to underage youth and to people with violent criminal histories that were prohibited from legal gun purchases. The trends in Baltimore and California cities I've looked at and other cities are quite dramatic after an exponential increase from 2017 to 2022. We've now seen it drop off a cliff, and these guns are much less likely to show up in violence. So I think that's part of this story as well. I'll also want to underscore, because I've been studying gun violence for over 30 years, and I see peaks and valleys and cycles. Aside from very specific programs or policies, there are also always cultural changes that are connected as well. We're seeing a reduction in alcohol consumption, particularly in binge drinking. Binge drinking is a strong risk factor for gun violence. And I suspect we may also see some shifts in among youth, and that's something I'm eager to study as well. Just locally in Baltimore, talking to some youth, in essence, you get a sense that maybe they've seen enough of violence, and they're starting to. I don't want to say we have a victory, but I think maybe things are going in the right direction. So I'll just conclude with stating that it's important. Well, we in public health, we think of gun violence as acting like a social contagion, and it's easy to understand that when gun violence surges, one shooting leads to another and another. But when we're thinking about this decline, it's important to recognize that it works in reverse as well. So each policy and program or effective intervention that prevents a shooting today is really preventing shootings down the line as well that would have occurred. So right now we're in a really great place on this downward trajectory. I have to note, I am concerned whether we can maintain that with the current federal focus in other directions.
Dr. Webster, thank you. There are several questions for you in the chat, but I'd like to start out with one of my own. Domestic violence has always been a precursor for gun violence. Could you just briefly address the correlation of domestic violence and gun violence?
Yeah, so certainly an important segment of gun violence is domestic violence. It's something that I have studied, and with my colleague Jackie Campbell at Johns Hopkins, in a study we did, we found when we were looking to try to better understand what leads to fatal outcomes from domestic violence, the number one factor was the abuser's access to a firearm. It elevated rates or risk for fatal outcomes about fivefold compared to abusers who didn't have firearms. And that's after you controlled for, lots of other important factors. So guns, when you're looking at the lethal part of domestic violence, guns play a very important role. And I have studied laws that specifically try to restrict access to people with histories of domestic violence. And even though enforcement could be far better than it is, we still see that these laws have saved lives. And basically, the stronger those laws are, the stronger the prevention, meaning more domestic homicides are prevented.
Thank you. Christopher Young has a question for you. Christopher, please ask your question. He's from the Mississippi Link newspaper.
Yes, thank you so much, Sunita, and thank you to all the panelists. Dr. Webster, I'm wondering, with a body of in excess of 30 years of studying this topic, what opportunities have you had or do you have to speak directly to legislators, to bring your expertise to the fore, even though you'd be introducing it to those political minds? Do you get that opportunity?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Sometimes I get that opportunity. Sometimes I'm invited specifically by legislators to hearings. Sometimes I invite myself to those hearings and do that. I will say, the tragedy that happened in around this time of year in 2012 in Newtown, Connecticut, with the Sandy Hook shooting. I with some colleagues, I within a month, I put together a book and a summit on everything we know about gun violence and how to prevent it. And we delivered both hard copies and electronic copies to every member of the U.S. Congress, key members of the Obama administration, and to many legislators across the country. So I will, when there are opportunities to inform policymaking, I and my colleagues at Johns Hopkins are very committed to doing that.
Thank you. We're running out of time, but I have a question for all speakers. Given that you're speaking to a room full of reporters, how would you advise us on how to correctly cover the issue of gun violence and mass shootings? Let's start with you, Dr. Webster.
Yeah, I think the most important thing I would really underscore is that these are preventable. When these things happen in our news feed all too regularly, it's easy for people to just say, "Oh my God, it'll never stop. There's nothing we can do about it." But the research says otherwise. Now, while most of my research is not focused specifically on mass shootings, I did publish one study where we did indeed along the lines of what Dr. Gergis was saying earlier, yeah, stronger gun laws do lead to fewer mass shootings. They don't eliminate it completely, but again, I think the overall message is to be really clear that that there are ways to reduce and have much lower rates of gun violence if we commit ourselves to it.
Thank you, Dr. Webster. Dr. Gergis, could you address this question? I'm sorry, I'm stumbling. But Dr. Gergis, could you address the question as well? How can media responsibly cover mass shootings?
Yeah, I can basically just agree with Dr. Webster. He's right. This is preventable, and I think that's the most important thing.
Thank you. Sarah Lerner, final thoughts?
I, of course, agree with the doctors, but I will also say that trauma-informed journalism is a really big, important thing. And how you speak to a survivor, how you speak to the families of victims, it makes a difference. And I can tell you that there were reporters and news outlets I was very willing to talk to after our shooting and still. And there were others I was not and will not because of how unprofessional, inappropriate, they were in speaking to not only me, but my students. So I think, being trauma informed is very important.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all the speakers today, and thank you to reporters who joined the call today. We will not have briefings next week and the following week. Wishing you all a very happy holiday season, and we'll see you on January 9th again. Thank you.